Hello, you're watching Roundtable. Famine is once again threatening Somalia. Millions going hungry, leaving their homes. They are desperate for help, and so far, little help has come. Climate change is just one of the many contributing factors. So why is this happening now? And who might be to blame? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Almost 1,500 children are being admitted to hospital for malnutrition every day as severe droughts threaten the country.
Today, it's 4 failed rains. The 5th looks grim. The affected population is twice the size of 2011. Things are bad, and every sign indicates that they are going to get worse. So without greater action, without greater investment, we are facing the death of children on a scale not seen in half a century.
Yes, climate change has exacerbated the situation, and political instability in the country has hampered humanitarian efforts. All of our guests are originally from Somalia. We go first to Leicester in the UK. Dr. Idil Osman is their lecturer in media and communications at the University of Leicester, then to Kuwait. And Abdirashid Elmi is their associate professor in environmental science and technology at Kuwait University. And then to Toronto in Canada. Hani Mohammed awaits us there, director at Restore Somalia Foundation. Idil Osman, let me come to you first of all. Droughts in 2011, 2012, 2017. Is this one on the same scale or worse?
Thanks, David, for having me on the show. I think this time it's looking a lot worse because it's a combination of a number of shocks. So we're dealing with the aftermath of COVID. We're also dealing with the Ukraine-Russia crisis that's having an impact on Somalia as well. And so this is coming hot on the heels of already existing crises that the country has been dealing with. So unfortunately, this is looking a lot worse than the previous ones we have seen. But it's also coming in the context of people being fatigued by these multiple crises that the global world has been facing.
So we're talking about donor fatigue and media attention and so many different factors. How many people do you think are being affected this time compared to, let's say, 2017? Twice as many?
Close to that. The UN and the NGO communities are estimating that it is a lot worse this time round, especially because not a lot of attention is actually being given to the crisis. Like you mentioned, the media fatigue, donor fatigue, all of that is leading to a lack of attention being given to the actual scale of the crisis on the ground. So this is looking to be worse than what we've seen in 2017. And so it's important that it is mitigated before it turns into a famine.
Well, let's take a look at a map of Somalia. Population 16.36 million. That was 2021. Of that, roughly half, 7.8 million affected by the drought, and 1.17 million of them are now internally displaced. They've had to leave their homes because of the drought. The number of children with acute malnutrition, nearly 1.8 million. Abdirashid, let me ask you, you've written a report about what you think the response should be. Tell me what your recommendations are and how much has actually been followed up.
Thank you very much for having me, and hello everyone. With respect to what we put on the report or recommendation is, we divided recommendation into 2 main parts. One is the short term, and one is the long term. Couple of points are the long term. So let me start with the short term because where we are now, according to the data we collected over the last 3 months, the data we collected show that what actually needs to be done right now is to save as many lives as possible. We have already lost quite a large number of human lives, mainly children who were not able to walk long distances. So our recommendation is, the short-term recommendation included, first, to mobilize resources, starting with the Somalis, both inside and outside in the diaspora, and see what resources can be collected as urgently as possible in order to save lives. These life lost are preventable, quite frankly, because what needs to be done is two things: that these people, they have something to eat, that's the food emergency, and water. Those are two most essential resources that could have saved a lot of lives. So the first point was to mobilize resources, starting with Somalis both back home and in the diaspora, as well as encouraging the government to, despite its limited resources and ability, to do what it can, because we felt like the government is now maybe really busy and is putting a lot of emphasis on.
Well, we'll talk about whether the
fighting.
government is stable enough to do that in just a moment, and you'll come back with your longer-term recommendations. But I would love to bring in Honey at this particular point. I was looking at the United Nations website before we came into the studio, and it said, the World Food Programme is delivering life-saving aid to record numbers in Somalia, 4 million a month. What do you think about that sort of trumpeting?
Well, David, thank you for having me, first of all, and hi, everyone. So if you look at numbers, like let's go back, there's so many droughts that happen, and droughts is not uncommon in Somalia. In 2011 famine, close to 300,000 people died because the UN declaration of famine came too late. Now, 2017 famine, because of lesson learned of the 2011 famine, earlier reaction happened and funds were mobilized earlier, but still 45,000 people died. Now, we are in 2022. Warnings were issued in 2021 actually. Earlier 2021 warnings were issued, end of 2022, and not even half of the funds are mobilized. So yes, Somalia is receiving help, people are receiving help, but is it as quick? Is it as fast? Or, I feel like the United Nations or international organization are 1 to 2 steps behind of the current situation that's happening. So the situation on the ground is really severe, and data as they're being delivered for help, whenever it's received, we always have to assume is worse than what we see. So help is coming, but it's not as fast
and
as it
they
should.
say it's life-saving help, but 1,500 children a day are being admitted to hospital with severe malnutrition. What kind of chances do they have with the healthcare system in Somalia?
It's really drastic and severe, especially in some areas. If you look at the southwest region, that's one of the areas that's the most impacted. So earlier in the year, Southwest was, I think, state 4 of the famine, and state 4 actually of the emergency and the severity of the conditions that the people are in. But then state 5 is famine. Now, this was declared beginning of the year. So now kids, children, infants are dying, and they have like acute, it's really painful to talk about it, especially when you see data. But famine are mostly affecting children. Women are walking days and weeks, and some of them, they start their journey with 4 or 5 children. By the time they reach out to the camp, one of the women that we interviewed, by the time she reached at the camp, she only had 1 child. She was carrying 1 child, and she lost 3 kids on the road.
Goodness gracious.
So the situation is really severe, drastic, and it will get worse and worse.
The lack of rain is affecting large parts of the Horn of Africa. In other countries, they aren't doing as badly. Is that because the security situation with the presence of al-Shabaab, with a fragmented government that doesn't seem to have proper control, is it because things aren't able to run properly in Somalia?
David, there are a number of factors that make the situation quite complex. On one hand is what you've mentioned, it's the security conditions. There are parts of the country that are controlled by al-Shabaab and therefore impenetrable for aid agencies. But then you also have the lack of capacity of government institutions for them to be able to put systems in place that can prevent drought. Somalia is in a region that is considered arid, so is the rest of East Africa, but yet none of our neighboring countries actually have this level of crisis that they're dealing with every few years. And yet this continues to be a recurring issue for Somali, and that is precisely because measurements are not being put in place to prevent situations turning into drought. So that's one issue. The security is another issue. And then the third element is the short-termism of the international community. Every time a situation like this happens, there is a very short-term approach to finding solutions. So they're not thinking about how can we equip people and at least empower them to think about ways that they can sustain themselves, to empower them to mitigate circumstances like droughts affecting them. Instead, they're always thinking about meeting the immediate needs. You feed them today,
tell me
you give them
why
drinks
this
today.
hasn't happened.
The situation happens again tomorrow.
Okay, tell me why the proper changes haven't been made, because as a news person, my mind goes back to 1984, 85, the famine in Ethiopia. We were told that an awful lot of community projects were set up, small-time farmers able to look after themselves, their families, their immediate needs, and we were told that was a success story. So why hasn't that happened in Somalia?
This is what I'm wondering, David. I mean, there's no lack of solution. There are, there's lots of recommendations, lots of solutions that have been suggested by various different experts and agencies. It's the lack of implementation. On one hand, you have a government institution that severely lacks in capacity, particularly from an institutional perspective. And then you also have a donor community and an NGO community that seem to be focusing on finding short-term solutions. On one hand, there are the international pressures. So if we're talking in the immediate context in the last 2-3 years, obviously there's been COVID, there's been the Ukraine and Russia crisis. So donors are feeling the fatigue of having to fund and look after yet another crisis. But then on the other hand, this is not something that is new. Somalia has been dealing with this issue for years and years and years, and yet we've always had this very short-term, simplistic approach of just trying to meet the crisis right now, and we'll deal with tomorrow later. So, this is where I become really critical of the humanitarian industry that operates in Somalia, because you have to think beyond the needs of today so that you can try and make people self-sustainable and therefore no longer in need of humanitarian support.
Well, maybe Abdirashid, maybe you could throw some light on why this hasn't happened successfully.
There could be a number of reasons, of course, but the reason why drought has become recurrent in Somalia has got something to do with of course, climate changing so rapidly, and because of geographic location of Somalia, low-lying land, and very long coastal sea. Those two factors combined together are the main causes of climate to change much more rapidly compared to neighboring countries. One more point is, drought is a meteorological condition, and it doesn't have to evolve into famine. So when it comes famine is when human intervention somehow didn't work. So one simple fact that's often overlooked in the discussions is that why Somalia? For example, when you look at the meteorological condition, the amount of rain, distribution of rain, all those meteorological factors, when you look at them, Somalia is not drier than neighboring countries, say, for example, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, for example. And still, those countries do not experience famine as frequent as Somalia. So there has to be something else. So we cannot blame everything on, yes, climate change is a factor.
So is it the fact that the government is ineffective?
Definitely is one of them. Institutional capacity to respond early enough, and even before responding, the ability to predict what may be coming and the intensity of that or magnitude of that, and what should be done to prepare an appropriate response. So all that comes down to institutional capacity, which is either weak or absent in the case of Somalia.
So there is an organization called the East African Community, and I saw a picture of the president of Somalia talking to a representative from this group, which is presumably there to encourage cooperation between countries in a particular part of Africa. Somalia is not a member. The president said he'd like that to happen soon. Is it getting any help from neighbors?
No, I haven't seen president making that kind of a statement, and therefore I really don't have enough information for me to comment on that. But generally speaking, as participants mentioned earlier, the response, generally speaking, is either too little, too late, or in many cases, it is non-existent. Whatever the reason is, the reason could be like countries are just coming off COVID-19, which affected so badly the global economy, and also maybe the conflict that's raging in Ukraine. Whatever the reason may be, the response was either too little or too late to save lives in the case of Somalia.
Kandi, let me come to you. You talked about the personal stories, and that is really what this is about: individuals, family groups, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And we've heard from just 3 of them, and in one of the internally displaced persons camp.
I have 6 children. I fled from the drought. I fled because there was no water, no food. The hardship brought us here. We came on foot. We did not come by car. We walked for 7 days. We left our husbands. Then while on foot, we were given a lift in cars.
I had fled from drought from Blomara town in the lower Shabelle region. I have 5 children. I had 7 children. 2 died while they were babies because of the thirst and hunger of the drought. And we fled from locusts and wars. Now we are in these IDP camps and still need support.
I have fled from Lower Shabelle region. This is the 4th year of drought. Cows, goats, and farms all perished. I left my husband. 3 of my sons died on the way due to hunger and thirst as we walked. 4 of my children and I managed to reach here. We have nothing.
Have you any idea what conditions are like in the camps?
The camps are overcrowded, and there's not enough capacity or resources to help everyone coming to the camp. The conditions, sanitation is really bad. People are reaching to the camp seeking for food, but there is not enough in there. Some of the camps in the region of Bai, Bakal, they already passed the capacity. Mostly we see women, children with malnutrition. And we have to know that by the time we get data or numbers from people that are on the ground showing us the conditions on the camp, and the time that we react on it takes about 3 months. And these data are not accurate. The projected data are never accurate. So some of the camps, they're no longer camps. I would say they're not camps that can handle the capacity or the needs or the demand of the people. There's a lot of not just malnutrition, but kids are being buried on the sides of the camp. And it's not even proper burial. And it's really drastic over there.
Oh, terrible. Let me come to you, and I'm going to read something out from the presidential envoy for Somalia's drought response by the name of Abdirahman Abdishakur Wassami. And he says the UK is still an ally and they help with security. But when it comes to humanitarian response, they are not. They're not in leadership or in aid. It has all gone. The UK used to provide a leadership that others would follow. Now, the UK has cut the amount of money that it puts into overseas aid. I'm sure you have a critical response to that. But is it the same with other countries as well? And that is also down to external factors, as you say, like the war in Ukraine and COVID. You can't be surprised at this if you are, as I imagine, disappointed.
Absolutely, David. So there are a number of issues that are affecting this approach. So, or this response from the UK government, as well as other European governments. One is what's happening geopolitically within Europe. So you have a much more nationalistic sort of agenda that most of these countries are now enforcing. So you will see that there is a lot more focus on inland, and sort of the national interests. You see a lot more of the far-right parties gaining more traction in politics in recent elections. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, that's happening. If you look at other parts of Europe, and right here in UK, we've had Brexit. And so there's a lot more of policies that are becoming a lot more implemented that look more inwards, and therefore less outwards and focusing on foreign aid and developments in parts of the world.
What would you say? What would you say to the UK government? Can I just put this? What would you say to the UK government? We've got a new Prime Minister. What would you say when they're contemplating cuts? That it is imperative that money goes on overseas aid, not just for the sake of the individuals, but perhaps for security reasons as well, and stability. How would you argue your case?
Well, I mean, for me, it's about balance. It's about making sure that, we understand that governments obviously need to have national interest at heart, but then they also need to think about their obligations in the foreign policy space. So on one hand, you've got countries that require a lot of support, places like Somalia, where conflicts and instability are making the country's governments and civil society almost impossible, putting them in a position where it's very difficult to meet the day-to-day needs of their people. And so they need to make sure that they are supporting people and meeting their international obligations. That's one. But then I also want to specifically highlight that we need to focus on long-term solutions. The short-term approach to humanitarianism and development is no longer working. We constantly see the same issues happening over and over again because donor countries and the NGOs on the ground that are implementing it are literally looking at it from a weeks and months kind of perspective instead of looking at long-term. How can you try and make people self-sustained and be able to rely on themselves? And that's the only way that we can get people to not be affected by droughts anymore. So it's two levels of support that the international community, including the UK, need to focus on.
Sorry, we've only got about a minute and a half left, so I'm just going to go to Hani, if I may. This is from a senior advisor to the mayor of Mogadishu, somebody called Hudan Ali, who says, just think what would happen if an entire European city died of hunger. I guarantee you things would change, and fast. Is it a question of one rule for us, another for them?
I wouldn't put it that way. I'll put maybe that international organization, there's a fatigue of it. There's a repetition of this happening over and over and over again. And 1992, which was one of the, I would say, most extreme famine that happened, we received the help. Somalia has received the help, and it was a quick. Now, the focus has been on Ukraine. We have to say a little bit of that. The focus has been mainly on Ukraine, and I think everything happened at the same time. There were not enough awareness around Somalia situation. There was no quick reaction by Somalis as well. We have to say it, it's on us to advocate, to show the situation on the ground, to speak up. So diaspora organizations or Somali diasporas, they did not advocate enough on the situation. Yeah. And with the economical situation that the world was experiencing, the war on Ukraine, there's so many factors that happened that contributed to that.
No, I get it. I get it. You understand why it's happened. You just wish it hadn't happened this way. As they say, it's all about events, dear boy, events. And unfortunately, that is the way of the world. Listen, so many millions of people in Somalia threatened with famine, some already undergoing famine conditions, and so many children among the victims. We wish it weren't that way at all. No, we do have to stop it, but I hope your message, I believe your message has got out. So thank you very, very much indeed for coming onto this program. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable, a chastening tale. Goodbye.